I apologize if you can't read the title, but I guess I'll read it just in case you didn't hear it. Kinematic controlled limbs during end-state comfort, we may learn at a very young age. Now, the reason I got involved in sounds very cool. I've done some end-state stuff, but I'm actually very interested in looking at how we develop motor control. So how does this actually emerge in people? How do we control movements? How do we learn to use objects? And I promise that we didn't get together in the morning and said we're all going to talk about cups of coffee, but it just happened to be that way. But it is something that we take for granted. When we reach for a cup of coffee, or when we reach to use our keys, or whatever it may be, a lot of the times we take for granted. How is it that we actually reach for it? How do we learn to use it? And once we have it in our hands, how do we manipulate it without even looking at it? So these are the things that I am interested in learning how we do this. And a good starting point to learn how we use objects was actually proposed by Gibson in '79. And he proposed that every object has an affordance. That's an inherent property that tells us what we can and what we cannot do with that object. But what I want to know is what physical characteristics have to be present for us to actually get an affordance or to elicit an affordance. So when we look at an object, is just seeing a picture enough of an affordance? Some people argue, like Tucker Nellis did, yes, it is enough to get an affordance. So when we look at something like this, do we know that we can grab the, not really. So do we know that we grab it by using the handle, and we use this end to actually hit something with it? Or do we have to have more information about the object? So now if we see this object, I'm pretty sure most of us have used the hammer in our lifetime. So we probably know that we have to grab it by the handle, and then there's a surface that we can hit a nail or whatever it is with, and there's a surface that we can use it to extract the nail. So these are things that, again, most of us take for granted, but when we are children, do we actually know this? Do we know exactly how to use an object right away? Or do we have to learn by actually seeing someone use that object first, getting our mirror neurons to fire, and then being like, oh, so that's how you use that object. So these are kind of things that, again, drive my research, is finding out how exactly do we learn to use objects and what's important about these objects. So how do we measure an affordance? What gives us that information? This is how you use that object. Now, traditionally, affordances have been, one of the ways to measure affordances is by looking at reaction time. Again, Tucker Nellis and others have used this kind of information. But there's other ways. In this paper, they actually use velocity to look at a difference between showing you a photo of an object and actually giving you an object to use. And I'm just going to talk about the top graph here. The bottom graph is actually someone who has apraxia, but it's not the focus of my talk today. So in this case, this is velocity, in case you can't see it from the back. And this is when you're using a photo to guide your movement. And in this one, this is the velocity, and this is when you're using an object to guide your movement. And what you see is that there is a difference between the two. You actually exhibit higher velocities when you're using a photo versus when you're using an object. So even just looking at a photo versus a real object changes how you actually carry out your movements. So as Sara was demonstrating, we saw that adults have end-state comfort pretty much 100% of the time, or 100% of the time. And that adult-like patterns emerge around the age of 9 in terms of end-state comfort. And she demonstrated specifically that when you use an image in a cup, that in children show that end-state comfort. I'm not going to go through her talk again, but just to remind you. Now the question is, this is something that is an outcome measure. So it's very nice because it gives us a correct versus a less correct movement. A correct movement would be if I pick up a cup and I'm going to use it to drink out of it, I'm going to have an end-state comfort that's comfortable to drink out of it. So that's a correct movement. But if it's, let's say if it's upside down and I pick it up and then I turn it around to try and drink out of it, that's very awkward. And for us, that's a less correct movement. So it gives us a measure of what is correct, what is less correct. But it doesn't tell us anything about how you go about actually controlling your movement to grab the object. So I wanted to look at the kinematic profiles of the children and the adults to see how is it that they control their movements while picking up an object. And in the literature, it has been shown that there are differences between adult and child patterns. In this case, the children were 6 to 7-year-olds, but we do see a difference in a pattern, especially down here. We see that they're more variable compared to the adult-like patterns. So this is a good way to see how are they controlling the movements. We should get differences between children and adults in some of the measures, and what happens in an end-state comfort paradigm. So my questions for this was, how does motor control differ as a function of age? Does performance measures mirror the outcome measures that Sara was talking about for children and adults? And are there differences between a real object versus a photo that you use to guide your movements? My hypotheses were that children will probably have slower kinematics, as Eva and Sara mentioned. There's differences. So they probably have different kinematics. Maybe have slower reaction times, they might have slower peak velocity, or maybe longer movement times. Just compared to the adults in the literature, this has kind of been shown. And that pantomime would probably show higher kinematics. As I showed the paper by Hermsdorfer, the peak velocities were higher than when using a real object. So perhaps there's differences in peak velocity and movement time, again, when using a real object versus a photo, and so reaction time should change. And just to give you, I guess, an idea of how I measure this, so we had the eye replaced, and this is a typical velocity profile. So we asked people to actually move from left to right and back to center. So what you would see is something of a bell-shaped curve when you're looking at your velocity profile. And how we measure reaction time is actually by looking at the velocity profile and finding out when people reach a minimum of 10 millimeters per second for at least 20 consecutive milliseconds. This measure has been used previously by a lot of different researchers, such as Hansen et al. And Elliott et al. It's well established that, at least for any movements, this is a measure of reaction time. In the same manner, the way they measure the end of the movement is when you reach a velocity of less than 100 milliseconds for 20 consecutive milliseconds. So we use the same kind of measure. And yes, you can argue that there might be doing something here, but the way they measure is that this is the end of your primary movement. You might be doing a secondary movement here. And if you want to know why we don't choose a velocity of 0, it's because it's an arbitrary number. It doesn't mean, sometimes you might not see it in the graph that you reach a 0. You might go from positive 10 to negative 10 because you're actually switching directions, right? So a velocity of 0 doesn't indicate really well when somebody is not moving and reaching and aiming movements. Peak velocity, we just find as the peak during this. So this was time to peak velocity. This is time after peak velocity. And the reason we differentiate this is that time after peak velocity has been shown to incorporate a lot of visual information. So most of the people, the time after peak velocity is actually online driven. So a lot of visual information is coming back to actually guide your hand to where you want to move. And movement times the whole thing. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm just going to be talking about reaction time and peak velocity for the adults and the children. So methods, the same thing as Sara talked about. We had pantomime with no stimulus. Again, nothing presented them. We just asked them to show us how they would use this cup. Pantomime with a picture of a cup. We just show them a picture. Yeah, show us how they interact with the cup in a picture. We place the actual cup. Show us how you interact with it, but don't actually grasp it. And finally, grasp the cup and actually use it. And if you were paying close attention, you might be asking me, why are the ages different? I've only included the children and the adults that we had a full data set for. So I actually excluded one child because they kept moving before the go signal. So that actually affects our reaction time measures. as you might imagine. So I just excluded them for this analysis, as well as the adults. I threw away one participant so far because we couldn't get a full data set for their left hand. Now, reaction time, we said that it had to be at least 200 milliseconds. Anything below 150 we threw out because, as you may know, simple reaction time, the average is around 200 to 250. You're not going to move faster than that, especially for a task like this. So what did we find? Well, we found the reaction time, at least for the adults, is shown in red. And this is just reaction time plotted on the Y. This is pantomime without a stimulus, pantomime with a picture, pantomime with a cup, and actual use the cup. We find that reaction time for the pantomime without the stimulus is actually faster than the other three conditions that's noted by the start. So this is statistically different. So the adults are demonstrating a fast reaction time, which makes sense to us. Why? Because in this condition, if you remember, we're telling the participants you are going to be using your right or your left hand. The cup's going to be upside down. Go. So they have all the information before the go signal. And these three conditions, you have to open their eyes and realize what orientation is the cup placed, and then that's going to affect the reaction time. Now, what did we see in the children? We actually saw pretty much a similar pattern. We get, this is just trending towards significance, but hopefully with the addition of a couple more children, we're going to see that become significant. But the interesting thing is that between children and adults, we don't see a difference. These are all not different from each other. So they're behaving quite like us. Even though they might not be showing the same end-state comfort, the reaction time is actually similar to an adult. So this is peak velocity now, or yes, sorry, peak velocity plotted on the Y here in the same four conditions. And what we see is a trend for the adults to have a lower peak velocity for pantomiming without a stimulus. Now this is in contrast to what Hermsdorfer was showing, because if we were to go with data set from him, we should see a higher peak velocity here compared to this one. And these two probably be higher than use the actual cup. So we're showing the inverse, actually, of what Hermsdorfer showed in his paper. Now, what about the children? They're actually showing no difference at all between the four different conditions. So the velocity they're using to grab the cup or to pantomime is actually no different. And again, there is no difference between adults and kids. So again, it's showing us that for some reason the kids are behaving exactly. Now, if we look at the difference between upside down and right side up, and I forgot to mention this, there was no hand effects, by the way. And this peak velocity, again plotted. What we see is that the adults, we reached for right side up cup slower than an upside down. Now, you may be asking, why is that? Well, it could be that they're reaching a high peak velocity to get there, and then they might be spending a lot more time decelerating to actually guide their movement. So, but that's again time after and movement time. But if you're just looking at peak velocity, we are reaching towards the upside down cup with a higher peak velocity than the right side up. What about children? Again, same trend. We see that they also show this this trend where they're reaching for the right side up cup and with a slower peak velocity compared to the upside down. And again, we see no difference between the adults and the kids when reaching for the cup. So my hypotheses again were that children would have slower kinematics. So far, I haven't been able to show that my hypothesis was correct, and instead I'm showing the opposite. There has been no difference between reaction and peak velocity so far. Again, we're trying to get a couple more children, see if we do get a difference. And we might get a difference with movement time and other temporal measures. And we were thinking again, pantomime without, we show higher peak, or show higher kinematics compared to actually using a cup. Again, we are wrong in that. We show that the peak velocity might be even slower with pantomime without a stimulus. So it might be interesting to go back and think about why and why we didn't get the results. So what is next? Well, I gotta finish analyzing some of the other measures like movement time, transport time, reaction time. We know that reaction time is not correlated with movement time, which was said in the previous talk, that maybe just looking at reaction time is not the best bet. Don't play all your eggs in one basket. I also want to go back and look at the trials where they actually showed end state comfort and the trials where they didn't show end state comfort. Maybe there's a difference between doing the correct or more correct movement versus the one that's less correct. And lastly, I also want to look at the variability of movement, so the patterns, and just to highlight why. Well, again, if you look at the paper by Hermsdorfer, when you use photo to guide your movements, especially in this case, there's no difference between the photo and photo 2. They use the same stimulus, by the way. You see a greater variability compared when you're actually using the tool. So there's something about adding a physical object that constrains your movement to actually be more accurate to grab that object. So maybe if we look at that variability in space of how you're moving, we'll see a difference again between the children and the adults, and between pantomiming and actual puppies. And I'm actually just going to end it there. I'd just like to thank all the people who have been involved in this, and I'll take any questions.
Just a question about the photo condition. Was the picture of the cup to scale?
Yes. It was the same size as the actual cup.
And it was at, when they look at it, was it at a location where they would have moved their hand?
So it was in the, so there's an X on the table, and both the cup and the picture of the cup were a little bit further because we wanted them to actually move their hand to the X, and that's where we placed the cup when they were going to actually use it. So it's just a little bit further. It was about 10 centimeters behind that location. And to make sure they understood everything, we did ask them beforehand. We showed them the two photos and we said which one is upside down, which one is right side up. So we wanted to make sure there was no bias, or they were like, is that what orientation is that?
I was just thinking that that by changing the distance away that the cup is, even if it's small, that's going to change the affordance somewhat, if it's reachable or not reachable.
Yes, you're right. I still think the distance is reachable because a lot of the times, the first trial, what they actually did was they actually picked up the picture. And then we had to remind them, no, please don't pick up the picture, just look at the object and show us what you would do with it. But I do agree, in terms of the reachability, it does change if the distance changes.